Welcome to another policy video from the Ontario 360 project, housed at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Sean Spear. I'm a senior fellow at the Munk School and project co-director of Ontario 360. I'm joined today by my fellow co-director, Drew Fagan, who's also a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And we're pleased to have with us Charles Cirtwell, the president and CEO of the Northern Policy Institute, an author of a recent policy brief entitled Northern Connections. Charles, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for your contribution to our series in the lead up to the forthcoming Ontario election campaign.
Well, thank you for inviting me along today and for inviting us to participate in the discussion. I think that what Ontario 360 is doing in terms of informing that discussion leading into the provincial election is hugely important for the entire province, but especially for Northern Ontario.
Well, before we get into your paper, which sets out some recommendations on how Ontario's next government can make strategic investments to boost opportunity in Northern Ontario, why don't you just tell viewers a bit about the Northern Policy Institute, how long it's been around, and what your mission and mandate is?
Sure. So MPI was created almost 10 years ago. We started our 10th anniversary year in May of 2022. Goodness knows, I've now been in Thunder Bay 10 years. I came from Halifax, was recruited actually to launch the Institute. The Institute kind of has three mandates: measurement of Northern Ontario, capacity expansion in Northern Ontario, particularly human capacity, building skills in the municipal sector, and working with First Nations in partnership with Canada to kind of meet the expectations and the promises under the treaties. And then, of course, our third mandate is to look at evidence-based policy to grow Northern Ontario in a way that allows more people to come here to work, raise a family, succeed, continue on generations. We started with two offices, one in Thunder Bay and one in Sudbury. We now opened a third in Kirkland Lake, Ontario. So we try to focus on working in those areas. Some of the things we've got that are big issues and have been since I got here 10 years ago continue to be measurement. It's tough to measure an area that's got 800,000 people spread over 800,000 kilometers. So we've each got our own individual kilometer squared. So it takes a little while to collect the information about us. But we've the importance of that reconciliation and that partnership, that working with First Nations is a huge area in Northern Ontario. First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Lots of opportunities to improve what we've been doing there. Lots of work going on the ground in terms of making our communities more welcoming, opening up opportunities for a population that's really been underserved and underengaged. A lot of transportation and communications issues, which we'll talk about in the paper. And of course, the demographic shift is impacting Northern Ontario in a real meaningful way. We saw with the 2021 census that Northern Ontario is starting to grow in some areas, but we're continuing to decline in others. And that's one of the biggest challenges I found since I got here is convincing policymakers to discuss Northern Ontario not as a single entity, but as the amalgam of numerous regions that it is.
Well, can I just say, Drew, before we get into the paper, congratulations to you and the team on your approaching 10-year anniversary. And as someone born and raised in Thunder Bay, I'm just so glad that NPI is there, bringing evidence to bear on these big questions facing the region. And with that, let's get into your policy brief, which really is speaks to kind of foundational needs for Northern Ontario.
It does indeed, and the title Northern Connections is well put, Charles. So you start actually noting the population in most areas of Northern Ontario is growing. And, viewers may not necessarily know that. So, you were making reference to StatsCan and some statistics with regard to that. So that's the first point, I think. And then let's talk about what you mean by connections, which is really digital infrastructure and physical infrastructure. So, but start off with demographics, if you would, a little bit.
Well, I came to Thunder Bay 10 years ago, and even then, there was the sky is falling stories. Everybody's leaving, no one's having children. It's a real issue. But in fact, even then, a decade ago, that wasn't true. Not everywhere. And that really gets to the point about Northern Ontario not being a single region. There's always been a robust growth, particularly in the First Nation and Indigenous population. So in Manitoulin Island area, in and around Kenora and Rainy River. So that's the far west, close to the Manitoba border, and then south of Sault Ste. Marie, areas that are growing because of that Indigenous population growth. Those families continue to have children, continue to expand the natural birth rate. The other areas that you see growing are those areas which are, Mike Moffat calls it drive to qualify. He talks about moving farther and farther away from the GTA so you can buy a house. Well, guess what? You can still buy a house in Sudbury at an affordable price. You can still buy a house in North Bay at an affordable price. You can still buy a house in Parry Sound and Sault Ste. Marie. And lots of people from the GTA have discovered that. So when you see the population trends in 2021 census, what you're seeing is those, what I call border areas to Southern Ontario growing. So North Bay, Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie are up on average about 3%. So that's a pretty significant population growth when you realize that for the decade before that, we were basically stagnant.
And you mentioned Parry Sound, so just technically, Northern Ontario, by definition, really starts around Parry Sound, doesn't it? It's a vast territory, obviously.
So for the province of Ontario, their definition includes Parry Sound and West. For the federal government, they actually add in Muskoka. Right. And then as you get farther west or farther north, the debate about what actually is Northern Ontario becomes a little bit more complex. As I'm sure Sean would know, that many people in places like Red Lake and Sioux Lookout, which are 400 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, wouldn't necessarily consider him a northerner.
So let's talk about infrastructure, and let's start with digital infrastructure and the challenge in the north with regard to building an economy on what you point out is inadequate digital infrastructure and the need for investment there. And of course, part of the challenge is just the huge amount of territory that it needs to cover. So let's cover that if we could, and then let's talk about physical infrastructure as well.
I think the frustrating thing for me as a northerner now for a decade is that it's 2022 and we're still talking about this. And when we start talking about physical infrastructure, the conversation's even worse. We've had a couple extra 100 years and we still haven't filled the gaps. But I saw an announcement just yesterday by the province of Ontario. They're committing another $900 million to IT infrastructure across the province. The challenge being that we're still trying to meet a standard that was set 20 years ago, 50-10, 50 megabytes upload, 10 megabytes download kind of exercise, or rather the other way around, 50 down and 10 up. But that standard was set at a time when most of us didn't have cell phones. Most of us didn't live our lives online. Most of us didn't interact with government in any way, shape, or form online. All of those things are different now. And so by the time we get to the 50-10 standard, which was set 22, 23 years ago, it'll be 5 years from now. Most of Europe has set a goal of 100 up or 100 down and 30 up. So basically we're spending another $900 million to be last globally. And so the point we're making is, it's going to be another 20 or 25 years before another serious investment in information technology is made in Northern Ontario. We recognize that's the reality. There are certain political priorities. So rather than building us to be last now, let's build us to be first now, so that 25 years from now, when we have the second raid, we'll actually still be relatively competitive. And that's a simple change. The province could quite easily say, you know what, the federal standard is too low. We say that all the time on a bunch of things. And so we could easily say, from Ontario's perspective, as many US states have said about the federal government there, you guys are out to lunch. The targets you're setting are way too low. They're not going to support our population. As a province, we're going to commit to 130. And yes, that's going to cost more money. Yes, it's going to take more time. But do you want to spend $900 million so that 100% of rural Ontarians can be last? Or do you want to spend $150 million so that 80% of rural Ontarians can be first? That's really the question.
To what extent do you think the private sector can play a role with regard to this? Because part of the challenge with the province, as you know, is in the GTHA, there's plenty of incentive in terms of population for the private sector to play the dominant role. In other parts of the province, the balance is different. How does that balance play out, particularly with your goal of sort of, reaching out to a much greater extent, or reaching up.
Yeah, the big challenge there is the technology. You're starting to see now the introduction of Starlink, so satellite-based rural internet, and now that technology actually allows it to be done in a profitable way. So to the extent that that moves beyond a single company, a single provider, I think you will see the private sector finally respond to these demands, simply because most everywhere else is saturated. So this is the place where they can grow their market share, build their customer base. And the simple fact is, first mover is going to have the advantage. You get internet to people who've never had it, and they're going to be loyal. And so there is a market-based incentive. There is a profit initiative for private sector players to get in. The challenge, of course, is that in Canada, at least, the innovation and the introduction of new technology is very slow compared to the rest of the world. So it's not a surprise to me that it's a US-based private company that's actually responding to this in a meaningful way first.
Maybe just at a kind of higher level, I referred to the paper's recommendations as foundational. You chose to prioritize digital infrastructure, which we've been talking about, and physical infrastructure. One of the things I really liked, Charles, is that you in fact say in the paper there are a bunch of other areas that you could have prioritized, but you chose these ones because of the foundational nature. Do you want to just elaborate on that? How you see improving the region's digital and physical infrastructure as a kind of means to making progress on a broader set of kind of socioeconomic priorities?
So I think that myself and many other commentators who work in Northern Ontario, who live in Northern Ontario, who've moved around in Northern Ontario would tell you that the number one economic opportunity here is the Indigenous population. They have real economic opportunities through their treaty rights and their community responsibilities that would allow them to grow, and such a space to progress from where they are to where they should be. And so partnering with and working with those communities in a true nation reconciliation-based, respect-based manner is a huge opportunity for Northern Ontario to grow in terms of both value-added addition to mining and forestry, to manufacturing, to production, to service growth. But the simple fact is that they're as disconnected as the rest of their neighbors are. And so until we fix the fundamental problem of an inability to get our goods and services to market, even those huge potentials are going to be under-recognized, under-realized, because they can grow as much as they want, but they can only sell to Thunder Bay. If you can sell to Paris and London and Berlin, your opportunities are so much greater. And it's not that I have anything against Thunder Bay, but there's only 100,000 of us. We can only buy so many things.
I think that's a point worth expanding upon. There's a tendency when we talk about rural broadband to characterize it as being primarily motivated by consumer or household needs and demands. We want to make sure that children are able to participate in online education, which of course has been highly relevant in the past couple of years. But this is fundamentally, or at least equally important as an economic tool, right? In the absence of the kind of high quality digital infrastructure referring to, it may become an impediment on forestry companies or mining companies adopting, the most recent technologies and so on. So do you want to talk a bit about both the kind of consumer or household aspect of the benefits of higher quality digital infrastructure, but as importantly, it is a kind of crucial input to economic competitiveness?
So it's interesting you talk about the economic opportunities tied to major mining and forestry projects. Most of the progress in that high-speed internet connectivity is tied to those kind of projects. So when you see mines that are using remote mining equipment, they're operating here in Thunder Bay in office settings, running equipment remotely 400, 500, 1,000 kilometers away underground. And so those connections, of course, get the priority because those companies are prepared to pay because there's a market for the goods and there's a return. What we tend to forget about, or what we tend to not talk about, is what's going on in smaller communities like Red Lake and Sioux Lookout and Cobalt. I had a chance a few years ago to visit both Red Lake and Cobalt. What amazed me was the number of home-based businesses, primarily driven by the female partners in many relationships, because of course the men are largely working in the mines underground. But there's such a diversity of products that are for sale, both First Nations products, creative products, and services. There's lawyers who are living with their partners in Red Lake, who there's clearly not enough clients in a company in a town the size of Red Lake, but they can provide those legal services. They can provide the architectural services. They can provide consulting advice online. And so when we talk about our inability to meet the demands of the jobs we already have, whether that's university professors, whether that's miners, and we talk about the need for partner opportunities, these are the things that are fundamental to it. If they don't have the capacity to access global markets and sell their goods, Cobalt has an amazing series of enterprises on their main street that are, yes, they have storefronts. Yes, they have walk-in traffic, but 80-90% of what they sell is online. They're all centered in a particular place because Canada Post is there, and they're selling their goods online and then mailing it off. That's the kind of access that you require. And then you look at a place like Thunder Bay that at the start of the COVID epidemic pandemic, we were talking to various people in the Chamber of Commerce here about whether the business community in Thunder Bay had the capacity to go online. And there were estimates ranging from somewhere between 35 and 50% of businesses were online or had an online presence. That meant over half of the businesses weren't even ready in a Thunder Bay community. So one of the largest communities in the Northwest, the largest community in the Northwest, one of the largest in the North. And those businesses, they're just not functioning online at all.
Maybe just a penultimate question about the paper's case for greater investments in physical infrastructure. Viewers will, I think, intuitively understand the economic case, but they may not appreciate the safety arguments that you bring to bear, which even as someone from Northern Ontario, I was struck by. Do you want to just maybe unpack for viewers how the region's current highway infrastructure in particular has contributed to higher rates of transportation fatalities than other parts of the province, and which it seems to me is a kind of point of analysis that probably goes underrepresented or undervalued at Queen's Park.
Well, I think one of the things that struck me when I was looking at the data, and again, I only looked at 2018 data because that was the most current available for Northern Ontario. And one of the things that struck me is that if you get in an accident in the Timiskaming district, so it's basically sort of north of North Bay, you are 3 times more likely to die than you are if you get in an accident anywhere else in Ontario. Now, yes, the odds of you dying in a fatal accident in Northern Ontario in 2022 is small, but it's 3 times the rate anywhere else in the province. The highways, if you get into an accident, you're much more likely to be seriously injured and fatally so in these regions because of the nature of the highway and the geography that it covers. And it's not simply that it's a 2-lane highway. It's the only 2-lane highway. In large portions of it, there's no cellular phone coverage. Yeah. So if you get into an accident, your ability to actually call for help is challenged. Now that has improved, but you still have a situation where large swaths of the highway, and in fact, we all know it, right? We talk about when you leave Sault Ste. Marie, there's a dead zone for the first 45 minutes. Forget about it. You're not going to be, if you're going east, forget about it. You're not going to be able to talk to anybody for at least the first 45 minutes. If you go north from Sudbury, there's at least a half hour or 45 minutes where you're not going to be able to talk to anybody. So if you hit a moose, if you hit the ditch, if you blow a tire, you're in trouble. And of course, that has real ramifications for those families and those people. And then you look at, well, you say, and one of the things Northern Policy likes to do is, okay, so what have other regions that look like us done? And so you go to a place like Sweden that looks exactly like we did 35, 40 years ago. And what they discovered was they could build 3 lanes instead of 2. They could have a physical barrier between the lanes shifting back and forth. And their deaths fell their accidents fell. They made their highways safer. They made them more economically reliable, and it was a marginal cost that was far more able to be absorbed than trying to twin every highway the way that New Brunswick did.
That's a really insightful point. I'm glad that you made it. Drew, do you have a final question?
Well, the issue of safety is paramount, obviously, but you were talking about getting goods to market across the continent and beyond, and that's fundamental to the point you make with regard to road expansion as well. And you make the point in the paper, which I thought was very interesting, is basically from Thunder Bay west to the Pacific Ocean, or for the Ontario-Manitoba border west, as opposed to the same distance east. The difference between divided 4-lane roads, highways, and 2-lane, and the point made about Sweden at 3 lanes and other parts of Europe is well taken. Maybe you just want to touch on that. The inequity just within Canada is quite striking from the statistics you cite, and ultimately you make points with regard to the cost effectiveness of new investment in Ontario.
Yeah, once upon a time, I used to be on Twitter. I was there for quite a while, and I abandoned it. But those of you who have access to the historical Twitter accounts will find a picture that I took about 6 years ago, standing on the Manitoba-Ontario border, and looking west. It's a fully divided 4-lane highway, median, controlled access, et cetera, and you turn east, and it's a 2-lane highway heading into trees, and it disappears. So on the Manitoba side, you can see for quite a ways. There's good lighting, good view sites. On the Ontario side, it's basically the same old back road that you used to take your girlfriend or boyfriend on when you came from the high school dance. And that's the reality for probably close to 1,200 or the 1,500 kilometers going east from that point. There's twinned highways in stretches between Thunder Bay and Nipigon that people love, but was that where we should have started? Politically, that was the choice that was made. And can we afford to do that all the way across? I don't think we can. I think that we need to look for more affordable, more accessible ways. And the way I try to make the point clear for folks who don't live in Northern Ontario, just how susceptible these highways are to separation is, just remember a few years ago, the headlines that said Canada was cut in half. We weren't kidding. When the Nipigon Bridge went down, there was literally no way for a vehicle to get across the country. And that happens in Northern Ontario on a weekly basis. If you have a multi-vehicle accident on one of these roads, they're shut down. And it's not, we'll put up a detour, you go 4 blocks that way, 5 blocks that way, 3 blocks that way, and you're back on the road. It's a multi-day, multi-hundred kilometer detour or reroute, or you just sit in a hotel and wait until they finally clear the road.
Let's just ask one final question, and it comes back to something you said at the outset, Charles. You've been at it now for over a decade. You've seen, you came to the region and you were faced with the kind of pessimism that really marked a lot of the popular commentary and discourse. 10 years in, what do you think about the region? Is there reason to be optimistic?
I think that the millennials and exennials, is that what the newer generations are called? Something like that. I get energized because I work with a huge team of people, some from Northern Ontario, some new arrivals in Northern Ontario, and they love the place. They have confidence about its growth. They have skills and knowledge that they've either brought to the region or have gone away and brought back to the region. So I take a lot of hope from their faith and their confidence.
Well, that's a good place to end. The paper, of course, is Northern Connections. Viewers can find it at our website, on360.ca. Charles Certwell, President and CEO of Northern Policy Institute, thank you so much for contributing to our pre-election series at the Ontario 360 Project and joining Drew and me for today's conversation.